The neon sign above Salerno Diner blinked in a tired rhythm that I had come to measure my nights by. Rain hammered the awning and smeared the streetlights into watercolor streaks. Inside the diner, the coffee machine hissed like a small animal. The oil in the fryer smoked faintly with the smell of Friday night fries, and my apron still carried a faint scent of lemon cleaner mixed with the old grease of thousands of late shifts. I had just cleared the last booth when I saw him sitting there, a man with hands that trembled in the way of arthritis and loss, a wool cap too thin for the cold. I slid a bowl of tomato soup in front of him without thinking, the same way I slid a clean napkin and a flat smile for everyone who came in at midnight. It was the sort of kindness that felt like sliding a coin into a meter, small, necessary, barely heroic. Then a man in a charcoal coat stepped in, followed by two others whose shoes clicked too loud on the tile. He laid a photograph on the counter like it could anchor the room in truth. His voice was flat and very certain. He said, "You have something she owes." The photograph was of my old neighbor in a garden, laughing, sun on her hair, as if nothing had ever stained her life. The bowl of soup steamed between us like a little proof that someone still tended to the living. I thought I was protecting a routine. I was about to become the center of a storm. I told myself later, when the memory replayed like a scratched record, that I had been tired enough to act without the calculations most people make. I put my hand on Mr. Romano's shoulder the way I had put my hand on the shoulder of other people who entered my life tired and hungry. It was not courage so much as habit. But the man with the photograph looked at me with the kind of clarity that cuts through Novocaine. He asked for the woman in the photograph by name, and when I said I did not know, he smiled as though my ignorance had been expected. He said the name again, and this time it was a promise as much as a question. The diner smelled then of rain and lemon and fear. The promise in his voice was simple and terrible. What began with a ladle and a bowl of soup turned into a countdown I had not signed up for. I had been Emily my whole life, which was another way of saying that I had never planned to be a hero or a criminal investigator. I was 29 and worked the late shift so I could keep my days clear for the community college course I took in public administration. My mother had died when I was 17, which left me with a hole in and a collection of unpaid bills. I learned to be quick with a grin and quicker with a plate. In the mornings, I fixed the bird feeder outside my apartment window because small, predictable rituals kept my mind from wandering into the sort of past that made rooms ache. My backstory is not romantic or cinematic. It is ledger entries and fractured sleep and a stubborn belief that doing a small good thing for someone was worth the small risks it involved. When I was a child, my father, back from a night shift, taught me how to balance a plate on my palm and how to listen for the rhythm in a city. He showed me that small hands could hold steady in chaos. He left when I was 10 and owed a story that never arrived. I learned then that absence asks questions you cannot answer, and sometimes you have to answer for other people. In college, I took an elective in urban history and heard about the old families, the old grudges, the men who built empires on silence. Those lectures felt like predictions. Mr. Romano, the man I fed, had the kind of face that makes you feel immediately like you belong to the margin of his story. He had lived on Mulberry for nearly 40 years and had taught me how to make the perfect polenta the winter I was too sick to breathe properly. We had an arrangement. He told me stories about his late wife, Rosa, about a garden they kept, and a piano that was tuned only on Sundays. He insisted on paying what he could, but mostly he came for the company. His name in my phone read Mr. Romano because I had never been able to call him by anything softer. He was 73 and smelled faintly of talc and mothballs and peppermint. He folded the photograph like a relic and kept looking at it. He had been hiding something the same way you hide a scar under a cuff. It was not until the man called Dante Moretti came with men in tailored coats that the secret began to bleed into the light. Dante Moretti was not the kind of antagonist whose childhood you expect to pity. He was a figure shaped by ambition and an inherited code, carrying the polish of men who had spent decades learning how to speak softly and make thunder happen at a distance. He had been raised in a house where loyalty was currency and silence was a sign. As a boy, he learned to count faces before words, to measure the reach of a handshake. By his 20s, he had sat at long tables where decisions that ruined neighborhoods were passed around with wine. His backstory is exactly the sort of engine that pushes empires built on fear. He had lost a brother to a power play and had learned painfully the usefulness of erasing witnesses. People who knew him, he described him as charming in the way a trap is charming and efficient in the way of a knife. He kept a calendar of favors and debts, and he never forgot a date. The men who worked under him called him boss without breathing the word like an apology. Dante was not cruel for the thrill of cruelty. He was methodical, which made him unforgivable. He had a captain under him, Vincenzo, who was hungry for advancement and blunt in the way of men whose hunger had hardened into teeth. Vincenzo wanted movement, wanted risk, and the whisper of his ambition smelled like gasoline in a closed room. The photograph on my counter turned out to be of Rosa Romano. When I asked Mr. Romano about it, he said nothing at first, which was its own confession. Then he said, "She used to go to the villa on the hill." He said it as if it were a map that had always been in his pocket. The villa had belonged to one of the families everyone spoke about in low tones, a place with statues and a gate that each summer swallowed a parade of expensive cars. The photograph had a return address scrawled in an old looping hand on the back, an address that matched a name Mr. Romano had whispered to me once, before coffee and before a tremor in his hands made the sugar cup rattle. That whisper was his daughter, Lucia. I had heard of Lucia as a woman who left and never returned, like a sentence cut mid-line. I decided to act as though the world still obeyed the rules I had been taught. I folded the photograph into my pocket like a talisman and told Mr. Romano I would walk him home that night. The city at 1 in the morning rings with different sounds than it does by day. Car alarms converse in the distance, the subway hum is a distant whale song, and neon gives the pavement a second life. On the route we passed Lena, my neighbor, who had been taking out a bag of recycling. Lena waved and I waved back. She lived 2 floors up and sold herbal salves from her kitchen table. She later became someone who would not be able to pretend she had not seen what she had seen. We passed Marco, who slept in his van on certain nights and owned a garage in Queens where people took things to be fixed and fixed their own worries there too. Marco would be the improbable ally who had a key to a locked place that smelled of oil and oak. He was a man whose hands were tattooed with dates that seemed to mark funerals. There was also Detective Harris, who I had met once when a regular had left a wallet and the city needed to know who had turned it in. He was the kind of cop whose cynicism wore like a coat, and he would later become a complicated help. Then there was Dr. Elena Morales, a forensic pathologist I never expected to meet outside of television shows. She would later give testimony that was more precise than any of us deserved. I did not immediately call the police for reasons that were both practical and childish. I was afraid of starting a clock I could not stop, and I was afraid of Mr. Romano's reaction. The man in the charcoal coat had looked at him in a way that implied deadlines. That night, I laid out options in my head like cards and realized I had none I trusted. In the morning, I told Marco about the photograph and about the men, and he laughed at first, like a man who is trying to make the absurd more manageable. Then he stopped laughing and said, "You do not have to do this alone." He offered his garage as a place to hide the photograph and any papers. He had a room in the back with a stack of old tires and a cabinet that hid things. Ally improbable, Marco smelled of motor oil and cumin and had the sort of grin that had fixed more than one stalled heart. He said if it got bad, he could take Mr. Romano upstate for a while, to his sister's place on a patch of land that smelled like chopped wood in a forgotten orchard. Marco had a younger brother named Paolo who kept chickens, and a man named Omar who dealt in used clocks and knew how to open office doors without a key. These names were the kind of network that grows when you live in cities long enough to owe people favors. The investigation began not with a badge, but with a ledger. Mr. Romano, in a shaky confession, pushed an envelope across my counter one slow afternoon when the diner was quiet and the rain made the windows into gray sheets. He said, "She left it in my glove box years ago, and I promised her I would never open it." The envelope was waterproof, the kind of sleeve you use for old receipts and love letters you do not trust paper to keep. Inside were photographs and a ledger and a scrunched note with an address in the same thin, looping hand as before. The ledger named companies and payments, amounts that moved like small earthquakes. Donations to campaigns, transfers to shell names, invoices that referenced nothing. It was thinly veiled corruption dressed as generosity. The more I read, the more my hands trembled. The diner seemed to shrink around me until it was only me and the ink on the paper. I thought of the policemen I had met, of chances and the slowness of justice, and felt the weight of Mr. Romano's trust like a thing that could sink me. We began to put the pieces together in the late-night hours when the city thinned and truths felt possible. Marco and I drove to the address on the back of the photograph, a villa that smelled of old money and roses. We parked under a plane tree and watched the gate for a long time. The villa's windows were like blank eyes at night. It took Detective Harris, who I finally called after a long internal argument, 2 days to bring a restraint without causing the kind of flash that would alert people like Vincenzo. His approach was bureaucratic and careful. He said things like chain of custody and witness protection with the reverence of a doctor speaking of surgery. He suggested we take copies, that we scan the ledger and hold them at the department, that we make sure Mr. Romano would be placed into protection if things escalated. His words were technical and oddly comforting. The procedure for protective custody was precise. Intake, temporary housing vetted by social workers, psychological evaluation, and a guarded hearing within 72 hours. I listened and wrote everything down in the margin of a receipt. We had our first real confrontation 2 nights later when a car with tinted windows idled outside the diner. It was late and only the regulars were there. Denise, who worked the night desk at the motel, a security guard named Sal, who slept in his shift in a way that made it look like part of a meditation practice, and a young student named Tamara, who studied law and ate a pie every Tuesday. The man in the charcoal coat came alone and took the stool at the counter for a while like he was tasting the place. He ordered black coffee and he watched the door. He called me by name in a way that made the room go still and said, "We can make this easy." He had a soft voice that was like the interior of a velvet glove. I answered, "You have the wrong person," and he smiled through a promise. His next sentence was a test. "Where is the envelope?" That exchange had the sort of rhythm tied to outcomes. I denied, and he let the silence press on. I refused to give up Mr. Romano. That night, he left a business card with a number. It was the kind of number you call when you want to measure the silence on the other end of a line. The conflicts mounted like storms. Vincenzo turned from man to serpent as he smelled opportunity. He began to show up at the villa in daylight, pretending to be an investor in the gardens, looking at the roses with fingers that did not bloom. Rumors spread in the neighborhood. A man named Angelo, who cut the grass for the ecclesiastical center down the block, began to gossip that the villa had once been a place for deals and for fines paid in cash. Rumors are like moths. They eat at the edges of things until truth is skeletal. In one long night, I found myself awake with the photograph laid on the kitchen table like a heart. Mr. Romano sat across from me and said, "She never wanted this." His words were a confession and a benediction. I asked him what he remembered. He closed his eyes and spoke of a woman who had loved gardens and music, who had once misplaced a key and found a secret room. He said she thought she was paying for things she could not undo. His voice broke. He said he would accept protection if I would sign a letter saying he had been my neighbor and that I had acted out of concern. I signed the letter with hands that could barely be my own. There were several extended moments of near disaster that felt like they could have been the end of everything we were trying to hold together. The first moment lasted the length of a breath and the length of a life. One evening, returning from Marco's garage with a copy of the ledger on a thumb drive, I saw a shadow move across the alley like a thought. Two men approached with the slow confidence of men who had rehearsed violence. There was a suitcase between them, and the air smelled of cheap cologne and old metal. I pressed myself against the corrugated steel of a back door and felt the grit press into my palms. My heart beat like a trapped bird. I heard my own voice inside my head saying, "Breathe." I thought of the bird feeder, the polenta lesson, the ledger. The men spoke in low voices about papers and payment and the name Moretti. The alley smelled of wet cardboard and gasoline from Marco's van. I stepped out with the poker I used to move a jam tray, and I called out, "Hey, you dropped something." The poker felt ridiculous, but it was a line I could hold. They turned as if the noise was an affront. Time stretched. I heard the kitchen from a distant room like an orchestra tuning up for a show. Then a car flashed by and the men melted into it. The poker had been as meaningless as a gesture, but the illusion of witnesses had been enough to save me. That moment left a bruise across my shoulders that would not fade. The second moment of tension took place in the villa when Detective Harris managed to get a warrant for a limited search after a financial tip came from an unnamed source. We were there, breathing the scent of old roses inside that room, when a floorboard gave under a carefully legged table and an entire ridge of the floor disclosed the trap. The house had been built with secrets, and the secret was a lead-lined chest with papers folded into medical wrappers and a pistol wrapped in cloth. The chest smelled of cedar and despair. My hands shook as I reached inside, and the air felt thick with the copper scent of old ink. Detective Harris called it evidence, and I called it a timeline. We took everything and cataloged it. The forensics team later described the process in the precise language of technicians. Photographs taken at 8 angles, swabs for DNA, luminol run where prints were found, chain of custody tagging, and secure storage in the evidence locker. Their words were clinical, but the chest felt like a judgment. That technical description was a lifeline. We had receipts of transfer that matched entries in the ledger, and one page bore a notation that matched the handwriting on the photograph envelope. That small technical match made the ledger into something that prosecutors could use. The third and longest tension built for weeks as Dante and Vincenzo responded to the slow pressure of documents and stories. We found ourselves living in a world of coded messages and anonymous calls, of cars that lingered in my block, and a sense that someone was trying to make a map of my habits to predict my betrayals. Marco offered the garage more earnestly then, and Lena turned her apartment into a staging point, keeping extra blankets and a kettle at the ready. Detective Harris brought Dr. Elena Morales to observe the ledger, and she found handwriting inconsistencies that scholars could not attribute to aging alone. Elena said, "A document like this bears the weight of an author and the weight of a false author." Her testimony later would read like a scalpel. The nights we spent strategizing were long and full of coffee. Tamara, who read case law like a bedtime story, typed memos until her eyes were red. Denise brought pie when things grew quiet, and Sal provided an extra set of ears at the door. Each person took a phrase of the story with them and kept it in their pockets like a coin. The betrayal came in a place I thought impossible, like the house was a safe that folded. Vincenzo, hungry and impatient, decided he could handle removing Mr. Romano himself. He believed he could stage a scene and make it look like a robbery gone wrong. He called in a man named Franco who owed him a favor and who kept his loyalty like a bargain. Franco had been a friend of Marco's once. He oil traded and cleaned motorcycle parts and had dark eyes that looked like they held rain. It was Franco who would be the instrument of a plan that backfired. On a night when I could not sleep, I went to check on Mr. Romano and found Franco in his hallway trying to coax him to accept a ride. He offered a story about a government van and temporary relocation. My voice rose more than I expected. I told Franco that Mr. Romano was under a protective umbrella and that he should leave. He looked at me with something like curiosity and said, "You are making this difficult." He tried to. I grabbed his hand, and the scene turned physical in a way that made my adrenaline taste like metal. We wrestled. The hallway smelled of old carpets and dust. It was then that Vincenzo arrived with a man to back him, and the situation turned into a collapse of options. The fight spread like light. There were voices and a plate breaking and a smell of lemon cleaner that usually meant cleanliness and suddenly meant nothing. In the scuffle, Mr. Romano banged his head on the banister and bled a thin line on the carpet. We managed to get Franco out of the house into the street, where he ran and staggered into a taxi like a man who had fled his own conscience. That night, the betrayal cut us deep because it showed that the enemy could stroll up the steps wearing our faces. The climax came not as a slow burn, but as a sudden ignition. Dante, learning of the increased attention to the villa and believing that the ledger would either disintegrate his arrangements or free him from the need to be quiet, made a decision that smashed the mutual illusion of safety. He sent men to the villa at 3 in the morning, men who moved like smoke and bore tools and matches. We had no idea until the night the smoke alarms pierced the neighborhood and the sky lit up as if the stars had been rearranged. We tried to get in, me with a key and a rage so loud it hurt, Detective Harris with handcuffs and a badge, Marco pushing a ladder against a broken window. The house burned like a chest opened for oxygen. We were inside, fighting flames and men and the future. Vincenzo was there, and in a cramped room where the clock stopped at 1 minute to 3, we found Rosa's piano half burned and a safe melted to its hinges. The fire ate furniture that smelled like cedar and dust and old roses. I remember the heat like a second skin and the sound of wood surrendering. We fought for the ledger as though it were a person we loved. I grabbed a corner of a bag that smelled of soot and ink. Dante's voice was behind me, and he said, "You were always too brave for your own good." The flames made his silhouette into an accusation. I could feel the ledger at the center of the bag like a heart that would not stop. Vincenzo lunged for the same corner. Our hands found each other's in a contest that felt like a tug of history. We moved toward the passage Luca, an old caretaker of the villa, had once told me about, a narrow opening under the piano that led to a walled garden and then out to a lane no one remembered. Luca had been one of the secondary names in the margins, the man who kept the roses and who had once been a teenage gardener at the villa. He had left a map scratched into the underside of a chair, and it saved us. We fled through that secret passage as flames lifted curtains like prayers. I felt heat rip my hair and the soot threaded my lashes. The envelope, the ledger, Mr. Romano's hope, all thudded against my chest as we staggered into the night. Marco and I carried Mr. Romano because he could not keep his footing. Detective Harris supported us with a steadiness I had not expected. Outside, the sky was already red, as if the city itself had been wounded. Someone called 911, and a voice on the line said they had cars on the way. The sounds around us were horns and shouts and a siren. We escaped with the ledger and a piece of the piano, a single ivory key. We could not save unread. Dante's men retreated under orders because their boss knew when a fire could be used and when it should be a statement. The ledger survived, slightly smoked, like testimony with a singed edge. After the fire, there was a long period of legal and procedural motion that felt both slow and urgently necessary. The investigators cataloged everything in a report that read like a history of greed. Forensic teams processed the scene with ultraviolet lights and swabs, and the process was described later in court as meticulous. They photographed every scorched scrap, they measured burn patterns, and they ran chemical analyses on accelerants found near the foundation. The protective custody protocol for Mr. Romano engaged. He was relocated to a safe house for an initial 30-day period with a social worker assigned. Detectives prepared charges for arson and attempted murder and for conspiracy to intimidate witnesses. The prosecutorial team, led by an assistant named Claire Mitchell, filed motions for seizure of assets and a freeze on accounts linked to the shell companies named in the ledger. Elena Morales testified about the handwriting variations and how they pointed to multiple authors or coercion. The legal process was a machine with many gears. Hearings scheduled, bail denied, subpoena served. It was exhausting and cathartic in a way I had not expected. The technical description of the investigation was precise and dry, but it saved us. It turned gossip into documentation and rumor into evidence. There were several courtroom scenes where the ledger was read aloud and where names like Moretti and Vincenzo and Franco echoed like accusations. There was a moment when Mr. Romano took the stand and said in his small voice, "She never wanted to be part of that life." His humble honesty carried a weight that roared across the room. The defense tried to paint him as a confused old man who had misremembered names and dates, but the ledger and Dr. Morales' testimony were stubborn in their truth. We watched as a bank account linked to the shell companies was frozen, and as the city announced an investigation into municipal contracts that had been siphoned. The process moved like a glacier, slow and unstoppable. There is a trauma in surviving that does not leave you whole. The physical scars faded. The ledger was entered into evidence and sealed. The villa's charred remains fenced off, and Dante Moretti found himself under indictment for a collection of charges. Vincenzo, whom greed had made sloppy, took a plea for a lesser charge in exchange for testimony. He spoke under oath about payoffs and threats and named names like someone reciting a recipe that had poisoned a family. Franco turned state's evidence as well, admitting his role and declaring that hunger had warped his better judgment. Their delations widened the investigation until higher nets were cast and more names were called to account. The community that had been afraid began to speak. Lena ran a fundraiser for Mr. Romano's temporary needs, and Denise organized nights at the diner where stories were shared like bread. Tamara and Marco and Sal became small pillars of a makeshift family that had grown around a ledger. I learned, by degrees, how fragile goodness is. A bowl of soup can be the beginning of a story that steals your sleep. Throughout the ordeal, I kept a photograph in a drawer under my bed, the edges curling like old leaves. I would take it out sometimes and press my thumb against the face smiling in the sunshine and try to find the moment where everything forked. The piano key I had smuggled from the villa sat on my counter. I would run a finger over it and feel a rhythm that seemed to say, "Sustain." The rhythm reminded me of my father teaching me how to keep balance on a plate. It reminded me that small habits can become resistance. At roughly 1/3 into our ordeal, when the prosecution filed its first major motion and when Vincenzo's betrayal had become public, I paused the narrative here and asked you, the listener, a question. If you had been in my place, what would you have done? Would you have protected a man whose past could set a powerful family against you? Start your comment with "I would have" or "I would not have" and tell me why. Your thoughts help shape the conversation, and they comfort the people who live with difficult choices. They also remind us that we do not face these moments alone. Now, back to what happened when we chose to stand. The trial unfolded with gauze and thunder. Dante sat in a suit that could not hide the way his hands trembled when a fact shook his certainty. When the ledger was displayed on a screen, the courtroom exhaled. There was an explosive testimony from a former comptroller named Sylvia who had counted cash and kept secrets until conscience made her act. She described concealed accounts and writers who signed with initials and the hush payments that have been dressed as philanthropic donations. The prosecutor asked the jury to imagine a city where corners were trimmed with money stolen from the public trust. The jury listened in long days. There was a point when Dante blurted out in a private conversation overheard by a bailiff that everything was a mess and that loyalty was for cowards. That backhand admission found itself into an affidavit. Near the end of the trial, there was an event that will always be lodged in my memory. A judge read out a sentence that felt like a closure all at once. Dante Moretti was convicted on several counts that included conspiracy to intimidate witnesses and racketeering related to municipal contracts. Vincenzo received a longer sentence than expected because his plea did not absolve him of violence. Franco and other minor players received reduced sentences in exchange for testimony, which felt like a bargain struck on a battlefield. Mr. Romano, in a small ceremony attended by people from the diner, laid a wreath near the charred gate of the villa. He said nothing dramatic, only that he had lost the garden and that justice, even if imperfect, was a form of sunlight. The community organized the cleanup and a small fund for the gardens that had been scorched. We donated supplies and labor, and the city placed a hold on redevelopment plans. What had begun as a bowl of soup became a civic moment. There were penalties and reforms. The city initiated a review of all contracts that matched the ledger's beneficiaries. A small committee was formed, and a handful of men and women who had been implicated were subject to civil suits in addition to criminal trials. The final unspooling revealed not only the reach of a few, but the casual complicity of many who took payments without asking questions. The ledger had been a skeleton key that opened cupboards no one had wanted to clean. Forensics had delivered a technical description in their report of how the ledgers matched transfers and how handwriting analysis placed the signatures. Prosecutors used bank subpoenas and phone records and queries to follow the money. It was painstaking work. The technical writing on the case file, which I read at times with a kind of reverence, described the sequence of seizures, the receipts of chain of custody, and the matching of metadata from emails. The law moved with the patience of a tidal current. In the aftermath, I had time to heal in small increments. Mr. Romano moved into a supervised apartment managed by the same social workers who had seen him through the first month. He started to attend a community choir on Thursdays, and to my surprise, his laugh returned in small pieces. Marco took a holiday to his sister's place upstate and patched the garage roof. Tamara finished the semester and accepted an internship in public defense. Detective Harris was promoted and wrote a memo about witness safety. Lena opened a small stall on Saturdays selling hand lotions and teas. Dr. Elena Morales kept working on handwriting studies and taught a workshop on forensic document examination at the community college where I had once sat as an eager student. Denise kept making pies. Each small action knit something back together. The epilogue arrived in measured seasons, and I will tell you how things evolved at 1 month, 3 months, and 6 months, because time marked the shape of the recovery like rings in a tree. 1 month later, Mr. Romano was settled into a flat in a quieter neighborhood. He had a volunteer who shopped for him and a phone that rang with calls from old choir friends. He had lost some mobility but gained a small network of people who made sure he took his medication and went to appointments. I visited with a thermos of coffee and the burnt piano key, and he pressed the key into my hand in a way that felt like a benediction. The city had frozen the primary bank account of one shell company and had begun administrative reviews of 2 smaller contracts. Detective Harris reported to me in a short message that they were following a lead on municipal emails. The community had held a small fundraiser that raised enough to plant 6 rose bushes at the community garden in Rosa's memory. It was modest, but the soil felt good. 3 months later, we had a hearing that resulted in an interim judgment against the developer who had benefited indirectly from the ledger's transfers. It was not a grand overthrow of corruption, but a crack that let light into a cupboard. Mr. Romano had started to attend the choir regularly and had met a woman named Agnes who chewed gum and hummed like a washing machine. Marco had returned to the city and had rehired an apprentice. Tamara had published an op-ed about witness protections that drew attention and a small grant to a legal clinic. Vincenzo was serving time and had written a letter that betrayed neither consolation nor remorse. Franco had entered a rehabilitation program and sent a postcard of anonymous thanks. The city announced a new transparency portal where citizens could check municipal contract awards. The ledger had become a civic instrument. People came to the diner and sometimes left a donation for the garden. The photograph I had kept ended up in Mr. Romano's small living room on a shelf. He had written a note on the back that said, "For days, for nights, for songs we almost forgot." 6 months later, Dante Moretti's appeals were ongoing, and some of his influence had been curtailed. The villa remained a ruin, but the city had decided not to sell the lot to developers. Instead, the council voted to convert part of it into a community green space as a concession to maintain public trust. The project was modest and would require fundraising, but the decision felt like a moral victory. Mr. Romano had become a small celebrity at the diner and sometimes told his stories in a way that made people cry openly. He taught a class about polenta at the community center and laughed when students asked for secrets they could not keep. Marco's garage had a children's program, and Tamara's clinic supported 3 new interns. Detective Harris received a commendation. Dr. Morales published a paper on document authenticity that cited our case as an example of community science aiding justice. The ledger, now cataloged and digitized, was part of a public archive used by journalists and scholars. We had won a battle, but not the war. Corruption exists like kudzu. You cut it back and watch the regrowth. Throughout all this, I kept to rituals that did not require courtrooms. I hung a small key on a string over my kitchen sink as a reminder of the piano key, and left an empty bowl of soup at the counter on days I wanted to remember the small beginnings. The photograph remained on Mr. Romano's shelf, and I learned to accept that people carry contradictions. I knew now that a single act of kindness can pull at the threads of a much larger fabric, and that choosing to protect someone is both a moral risk and a moral necessity. The ledger taught us that truth can be stubborn when documented, and that a community can be brave in ways the press cannot always measure. If you have reached this point and you felt the tightness in your chest at the moments I felt it, you are not alone. These stories are not only mine. They belong to everyone who ever set a plate down for someone else and then found that plate contained a map. If you like stories where small acts become tides, consider subscribing for more narratives where ordinary people make extraordinary choices. There is a playlist of similar cases that explore the consequences of kindness and the machinery of justice linked below the video. Stay curious and stay kind. In the end, I returned to the diner the way people return to churches, seeking to be held by a ritual. The neon still blinked with the same tired pattern, and the rain still turned the world to watercolor, but somewhere in the pattern there was a new rhythm. Mr. Romano dropped by sometimes and sat in the same booth by the window, his hands steadier and his stories longer. The photograph of Rosa had weathered our storm and had found its place on his shelf. I kept the piano key on my counter until one morning I walked it over to the community center and placed it on the table where children practice scales. I said nothing dramatic when I left it. I only felt a small fullness, like a cup finally washed. The day I risked my life to protect an elderly man from the Mafia taught me that courage is often quiet and that the ripples, a single decision can reach further than fear. The roses we planted at the community garden that spring were shy at first, but they grew. They grew because people watered them and because a ledger was turned into proof. The city learned to watch its money and its men a little more closely. The photograph that had started it all stayed in a small frame, and sometimes when the light hit it just right, you could see the echo of laughter in it. The final line I will leave you with is the same thought I had beneath the neon during all those nights. Small kindnesses can change destinies, and sometimes a bowl of soup is the first brave thing you ever do.